Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you, all of you, for joining us for this Naleo Educational Fund Facebook Live presentation on our projections for the Latino vote in November 2022. First, though, I'd like to acknowledge that we are doing this on a very tragic day for humanity and the world, given the events that are unfolding at this moment in Ukraine. We send our prayers to everyone who is under attack. We pray for their well-being, for their safety, and above all, we pray for peace. Here in this country, we are preparing for yet another exciting and polarized, perhaps, electoral year in which Latinos once again will play a decisive role. We have developed an analysis of the Latino vote projections for 2022 based on the past 5 midterm elections that have been held, looking at the trends of the Latino vote. I will shortly present those projections, talk a little bit about the unique situation that is occurring in Texas, given that March 1st will be Texas's primary election. And then my colleague, Elizabeth Billy, our Texas State Director, will share with us the field work that we are doing in Texas as we prepare for this primary election, as well as for the general election in November. So let's get started with our presentation on the Latino vote projections for November 2022. Next slide. First, I'd like to remind everybody about the elections that have been held to date in the past 5 midterm elections, and driving your attention to these 3 lines. The very top line represents the number of Latinos who are eligible to vote, meaning they are 18 years of age at least and US citizens. You see that line is growing at a very fast rate, driven in large part by the number of very young Latinos every year who are turning 18 and entering the electorate, as well as the addition of naturalized Latino citizens. That middle line is the number of Latinos who are registered to vote, and the bottom line represents the number of Latinos who turned out to vote, as reported by the current population surveys that are conducted by the US Census Bureau. And I'd like to draw your attention to the past 2 midterm elections in 2014 and 2018, because they have a significant impact on our modeling for the November 2022 turnout projections. You'll see that from 2010 to 2014, there was a very, very small increase in the number of Latino voters. So 2014 had a relatively low turnout of Latino voters, in large part because there weren't very many competitive elections being held in that election cycle, and the lack of investment in the mobilization of Latino voters by candidates and campaigns. We contrast that with 2018, which saw a tremendous leap in the number of Latino voters between 2 midterm elections. Next slide. And so let's take a closer look at election 2018. It had a historic turnout for the nation and the Latino community. 11.69 million Latinos cast ballots. That was a 73% increase over that historic low election of 2014 I referenced. And if you look at both the national turnout numbers and the Latino turnout numbers among registered voters, you'll see that in this election of 2018, Latinos are starting to track very closely to national turnout rates. And one of the messages that we have from the data that we've seen is that if we can get Latinos registered to vote, they will turn out. So one of the biggest barriers to getting Latinos voting is make sure that we can get Latinos registered. So any efforts to make registration easier will facilitate greater Latino voting. Any effort to make registration more difficult will have the opposite effect. Next slide. And then looking as well as the unique circumstances that occurred around election 2018. It was a pivotal moment for Latino voters. And there were several factors that really fueled the enthusiasm and the activism of Latinos. There were unique circumstances occurring throughout the country. We had a migrant caravan crisis. There was a rise in anti-Latino measures and comments by then President Trump. And 75% of Latino registered voters in a tracking poll that we held reported that these issues made them more interested in participating in election 2018. Add to that that there were very competitive statewide and congressional races. All of this came together to make 2018 a historic moment for the turnout of Latino voters. Next slide. So for November 2022, our projection is that the number of Latinos who will vote this year will closely mirror the number of Latinos who voted in 2018. We project 11.61 million Latinos will vote. This is a 71% increase over 2014, again, tracking very closely the margin of increase between 2014 and 2018. And once again, Latinos will represent 1 of every 10 US voters expected to vote. And so now we're on track for double-digit participation by Latinos representing their share of the national electorate of actual voters in elections. So that's a very exciting development for us to see that repeat now in 2 midterm election cycles. But let's take a closer look at the turnout of our voter turnout projections in states. In 3 states, we actually project that there will be an increase, not just the same number of Latinos, but an actual uptick in the number of Latino voters in 3 key states: Arizona, Colorado, and Nevada. In each of these 3 states, we project that there will be a significantly number of Latinos, more Latinos voting in 2022 than in 2018. We'll see nearly a 10% increase in Arizona, 9% increase in Colorado, and nearly a 6% increase in Nevada. Given that all these states will have competitive races, will make the Latino vote particularly impactful come November. Next slide. In 6 states that we track, we project that we will see roughly the same number of Latinos vote in 2022 as in 2018. These are the states of California, Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, and North Carolina. Even though there is a slight percentage change in each of these states, representing either a slight decrease or slight increase, those percent changes are not statistically significant. So the number of Latinos will be just about the same in 22 as in 2018. In 2 states, however, next slide, we project there actually will be a decrease in the number of Latinos who will turn out to vote. And those are the states of New Mexico and Texas. Again, these projections are based upon our statistical modeling of Latino voter turnout over the past 5 midterm elections and do not take into account any environmental circumstances that will affect Latino voter enthusiasm, the kinds of factors, for example, that fueled that massive turnout in 2018. Next slide. In terms of the number or the share of Latinos will comprise of all voters in these states, you'll see that they're increasing overall across the board. In Arizona, more than 1 out of 5 of all Arizonan voters will be Latino, more than 1 out of 4 in California. And as you go down this list, you'll see that that holds roughly across the board in all these states. Even in New Mexico, Latinos will be nearly 1 out of 3 voters. And in Texas, Latinos will be more than 1 out of 5 voters. And you'll see the projected turnout of Latino registered voters is consistently in the mid to high 60s and in the 70s. Again, making the point that if we can get Latinos registered to vote, we have a high potential to turn them out as well. Next slide. We also tracked using our modeling, the non-Hispanic voter turnout for the past 5 midterm elections. And we determined something quite significant, that in fact, at a national level, the number of non-Latinos expected to vote nationally will decrease by nearly 4%. And many states that we are tracking will also see a decrease in the number of non-Hispanic voters. California, Illinois, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, and Texas. So Texas, you'll see there, we projected a decrease of Latino voters, but we also project a decrease of all Texas voters. Next slide. In a couple states, we projected the number of voters in 2022 will be the same as in 2018, and those are the states of Arizona and Florida. And we project there will be an increase in voters in Colorado, in New Mexico overall, and in North Carolina. Next slide. So as we look at election 2022. Let's take into account now what are some of the factors that will potentially affect Latino voter turnout. Again, these factors are not taken into account in our statistical modeling for our projections, but could have a real impact on turnout. There is still the lingering impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Latinos and their access to the ballot. We are still looking at naturalization trends. We know that there was a slowdown in the processing of naturalizations over the past several years and an uptick most recently. We'll see what impact that would have. To the extent that there are competitive races in various states, that could drive outreach to Latino voters by candidates and campaigns. We expect very competitive races, for example, in Arizona and Nevada, Florida, and Georgia as well. There will be changes. There have been changes in voter registration laws and practices since the 2020 election, and this could have an impact on Latino voter turnout, particularly voter registration laws. Whereas we've seen getting Latinos registered to vote leads quite directly to an increase in the number of Latinos actually voting. Overall, what we will need to look at and track is to the extent that candidates and campaigns will invest in Latino mobilization and actually target Latino voters and encourage them and reach out and ask for their vote, which is something that our research consistently has held is what Latino voters want and expect from candidates and campaigns. Next slide. So this need for investment and mobilization is really tied to Latino voter turnout. Latinos want to be courted. They want their issues and their priorities to be addressed by candidates and campaigns. They don't want to be taken for granted by either party. And to the extent that candidates do not reach out to Latinos using strategies both in English and in Spanish, they really take at risk overlooking a impactful segment of the electorate in their states. Next slide. Now let's take a closer look at Texas as we approach that state's primary next Tuesday, March 1st. First, let's take a look at the numbers of the demographics of the state as we learned them from the 2020 census. Overall, the population of Texas increased by 4 million people from 25.1 to 29.1. The Latino population increased by nearly 2 million people, now numbering nearly 11.4 million Latinos in the state of Texas. Latinos once again represented the bulk of the increase of the population growth in that state. In the 2010 census, Latinos accounted for 2/3 of the population increase of Texas. In the 2020 census now, they accounted for nearly half of that state's population growth. And the Latino population grew faster than all other population groups in that state. And as a result, now Latinos are approaching 40% of that state population. And we project that in only a few years, Latinos will be the largest population group in Texas, representing a plurality of that state. Next slide. So as we look at voting in Texas in our projections, there are 4.2 million Latinos registered to vote currently in that state, and they represent more than 1 out of every 4 of all registered voters. Interestingly, but not surprisingly for us, Latino registered voters tend to be much younger than non-Latino registered voters. In fact, only 9% of non-Latino registered voters are 18 to 24 years of age, compared to 17% of Latinos registered to vote who are in that most of the youngest age bracket. 50% of all non-Latino registered voters are 50 years and older, compared to just 36% of all Latinos registered to vote being 50 years and older. And there'll be some factors that will affect Latino voter participation in Texas, given some developments. Next slide. We have seen, unfortunately, the adoption of some discriminatory redistricting plans by the state legislature. Despite the fact that the Latino population increased and represented more than nearly half of that state's population growth between 2010 and 2020, that growth is in no way reflected in the new maps adopted by the state. The state picked up 2 additional congressional seats, and in fact, Latino opportunity districts at the congressional level declined, and they declined in other areas as well. In the Texas House, the map reduces Latino opportunity districts by 3. The Texas State Senate map has no additional districts where Latinos have opportunities to elect candidates of their choice despite their population increase. And again, those 2 new congressional seats, not only did none of those 2 seats get converted into an opportunity district for Latinos, in fact, there was a decline of 1 Latino opportunity district overall in that state from 8 to 7. Not surprisingly, these maps are being challenged in court by our good friends at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and we wish them great success once again in this kind of litigation as they have in prior redistricting cycles. Next slide. In addition to these discriminatory redistricting maps, there also have been new laws adopted that affect policies dealing with voter registration and voter participation. Purges have been resumed that have been very likely to cancel or threaten to cancel the registration of many naturalized citizens, and this is, again, being challenged. There's a requirement for a unique ID number if somebody wants to register by mail, and if that unique number does not match on voters' registration records, that vote by mail application is deemed invalid. And in fact, there have been historic numbers of vote by mail applications being rejected, to the extent that Harris County itself has requested that the Federal Department of Justice investigate these rejections. And we know, of course, that there have been other restrictions placed on voting, such as restrictions on late night, early voting, drive-through voting, and how persons can assist voters. Next slide. So we at the Educational Fund will continue to do all that we can to ensure that our community is informed and empowered to vote. We know that the best voter is an informed voter who understands the practices, processes, laws, rules governing voting in their states. And we are doing everything we can to ensure that voters in Texas have access to that information. So we will once again have in operation our year-round toll-free bilingual hotline, 1-888-VEYVOTA, and that is 1-888-839-8682. We will have trained operators who can take your questions in English and Spanish in the days up to and on Election Day, answering any questions that you may have about the voter registration process, the location of your polling location, or any other questions you may have. And as well, if any voter encounters any difficulties or barriers to voting, be they through incompetence by elections officials or some real malice by people trying to prevent somebody from voting, we encourage those voters to call our hotline, as we are in coordination with attorneys, so that we can have rapid response and ensure to the extent possible that these voters will be able to cast a ballot on Election Day. And we're doing this work in the field in Texas. And now I'd like to invite my colleague, Elizabeth Billy, our Texas State Director, to share with us a little bit about the work that she and her team are doing to ensure a strong Latino voter turnout on March 1st and in November. Elizabeth.
Gracias, Arturo. Buenos días, buenas tardes. This Texas team has been working around the clock to ensure our Latino community have the resources and information they need to go to the polls through our VEYVOTA campaign. As we know, early voting is upon us, and for our Tejanos, if they're still interested in voting during early voting, we encourage you to go out and vote today or tomorrow. Tomorrow is the deadline for our early voting. But if you don't get a chance to, you can still vote on Election Day, Tuesday, March 1st, where the polls will be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Now on to sharing some of our field work. We've held to get out the vote text banks over the last month, and we've sent over 100,000 messages to ensure our community is prepared and aware of the elections, the voter registration deadlines that were upon us. We've also been sharing language accessible information to ensure our community have those resources available to them. And as Arturo referenced earlier, we're part of the Election Protection Coalition. We're monitoring that work locally, working with national and state partners to ensure Texans are available to vote, free of intimidation, suppression, and confusion. And as discussed earlier by Arturo, we're monitoring the unfair Texas election policies and the practices affecting these primaries. And to address some of those confusions that are coming and happening across the state, we've been leading election protection and SB 1 trainings to ensure that our community is aware of these. And we're sharing them both with community partners and also with media partners. We're also amplifying this message with the support of media interviews and media partners to amplify and share resources, and specifically our hotline. Today, you can text or call our 888-839-8682 for more information about the elections. We have hotline operators who are trained specifically on Texas-based issues and can provide you with information important on whether it's election-related, on the day of, check your voter registration status, start the voter registration status, or help find nonpartisan voter guides from trusted sources. We also provide information about vote by mail and the ID requirements as you head into the polls. Y nosotros también hablamos español. Envía esos mensajes de texto o llama a nuestra línea bilingüe al 888-839-8682 para recibir más información sobre las elecciones, donde puedes verificar tu registración de votante, te podemos dar información sobre las fechas límites y recibir más información sobre los requisitos para votar y cómo empezar ese proceso. Estamos aquí para apoyarte, darte todas las herramientas que necesitas y brindarte ese acceso al voto. That's it for me. Arturo, I'll send it back to you.
Gracias, Elizabeth, y tienes mucha razón. Somos bilingües, hablamos español también. Y estamos aquí dispuestos para ayudar a nuestra comunidad en español and in English. So thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing with us the work we're doing in Texas. So we have some time now for some questions. Please feel free to enter your questions into the comment section, and we'd be happy to answer them to the extent we can over the next few minutes. I also will invite my colleagues, our Senior Director of Civic Engagement Research, Dorian Call, and our Chief Public Policy Officer, Rosalind Gold, to join us if some of the questions are best directed to them. So let's see if we have our first question. Hello, will you post the slides too? Yes, we will be posting them on our webpage shortly at naleo.org. So be on the lookout for those. I also should mention that next week we will be publishing a profile of the Texas primary, where we will be sharing data again on the projected electorate of Texas, including the Latino electorate, and a run through of all the elections to watch where there are Latino candidates at the congressional level. Let's see. Next question from Alicia Ruiz. Oh, it's not a question. It's just an appreciation for us for sharing, and we're happy to do so. Thank you for joining us today. In Texas, who is eligible to vote early? When does in-person early voting begin? Elizabeth.
Thank you, Arturo. So anybody that's registered to vote and it's of age and register before the deadline for, in this case, for the primary was January 31st, you can actually vote in this upcoming election. But do know, you can always register and update your information at any time. You can go on to the Secretary of State's website. If you've already been registered at least once, you can update that information. But if not, you can always call our bilingual hotline number and we share that information. As referenced early voting period ran from February 14th and will go all the way through February 25th, which is tomorrow.
Thank you. Let's see if we have another question. I'm not sure if I'm registered to vote in Texas. How can I confirm my voter registration status? It's for you.
Thank you, Arturo. Great question. So there's a couple of ways. You can actually verify that information via votetexas.gov, which is the Secretary of State's website. You can also go to your local county election administrator's office or your county election clerk's office and verify that information as well. Or you can call us and we'll be able to provide you or guide you through that process as well.
Next question from Heather Linebaugh. Thank you for holding Texas Legislature accountable by providing this information. Absolutely. That is part of our role in the Leo Educational Fund to ensure that there are public policies that actually make it more accessible for all Americans to be able to participate in our democracy. So discriminatory redistricting plans, unfortunately, are one way to suppress, to disengage some voters, and we've seen that as being the history in Texas, and we will continue to be on the side of fair practices to allow all Tejanos to vote. Adrian Isaguirre says, I'm registered to vote, and I have what I need to bring to the polls on election day. Where do I go? What are election day voting location hours? Elizabeth.
Beautiful. So, as referenced earlier, where can you go to get your poll information? I would encourage you to go to your county officials or election administrator's office. Every county varies throughout the state. Some counties do all where you can vote in any polling location. Some counties have designated polling locations for individuals depending on where they live. So I encourage you to check that. If not, call our bilingual hotline. And then the election day, again, are 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Our hotline to share as well will be running concurrently through those same hours. So we're here to be of service to you all, to guide you, give you the polling location, whatever you need to make sure you go to the poll on election day.
Thank you. Let's see here. George Garreau, a reporter with the Washington-based Bloomberg government publication. Which Texas congressional districts are you watching most closely ahead of Tuesday's election? Do you have that information handy, Elizabeth? Because I know it's going to be released next week in our Texas primary profile.
I believe Ms. Rosalind may have more information about those key races.
Rosalind?
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes. So first of all, we are going to be watching the elections in both of the newly created districts, which I believe are 36 and 37. We're going to be watching the election in Congressional District 15. I think one of the most interesting primaries is going to be one involving incumbent Henry Cuellar, who is being challenged in the Democratic primary by Jessica Cisneros. She is a viable contender. So that will be an interesting race to watch. I think one of the most interesting races on the state level is the Attorney General race, where Latino Texas Land Commissioner George P. Bush is running for Attorney General and challenging the incumbent Ken Paxton. So those are some of the districts and races that we're keeping an eye on.
Thank you, Rosalind. Nicole Schultz, could you post the hotline number again? It's 888-VE-VOTA. You must have that number memorized, Elizabeth.
Yes, I do. 888-839-8682. 888-839-8682.
Adrian has another question for us. What should I do if I feel something unusual, uncomfortable, or illegal is happening when I go vote?
Great question, Adrian. So what you can do is call our hotline. Our hotline is both a resource-based information hotline and bilingual hotline, but it also is part of the Election Protection Coalition. So if there's anything that you're seeing at any given polling location, you can call us and we can track that information and be able to work with attorneys or whoever it's needed locally and at the state to make sure nobody is intimidated and has access to the polls and to voting on election day.
Un recordatorio que hablamos español. Pueden enviar mensajes de texto o llamar al 888-839-8682 para recibir información sobre las elecciones o también reportar cualquier incomodidad que tengan unos cuando vayan a votar. Y estamos disponibles en los días antes de las elecciones y en día de las elecciones también en 1 de marzo. B. Gonzalez Ramirez says, thank you for everything we're doing for our gente, for our people. Absolutely. That's why we're here. Mm-hmm. And that is NALEO Educational Fund's mission. And if you want to help us in this mission and contribute to our efforts and invest in our work, please visit our website at naleo.org. We could always use your help as we try to expand our efforts. Let's see if there's any more questions. If not, we may wrap up this session. Nicole Schultz has another question. How can we encourage our friends, family, and loved ones to get out there and vote? All right, Elizabeth, this is your forte.
All right. What I always say, that they have us as a resource, that we, there's tons of organizations, including ours, doing phenomenal work to get the word out, that they have us and so many to provide resources, nonpartisan information available at their disposal. What I always say is we want to provide the tools and the information you need so that you make the most informed decision. So que nosotros podemos darles esas herramientas que necesitan para hacer las decisiones que necesitan hacer en las elecciones, sea guía de votantes, sea información básica de cómo empezar el proceso de registrarse a votar, y cómo votar en las elecciones. Estamos aquí a su disponibilidad y que pueden pasar esa información a sus amigos y amigas. You can share this information with family and friends and encourage them. Our power is in our vote, and the only way we can make changes in our community and who represents us is through actively voting every given election, from state, local, all the way to federal.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for joining me from Texas, from Houston. I'm here in Los Angeles, and we're working across the country at NALEO Educational Fund to do all that we can to ensure that Latinos are able to cast an informed and empowered ballot, and that they can do so freely and with a full accessibility. It is part of our mission to promote the full participation of Latinos in the American political process. We don't do this work alone. We work with many other organizations, and in Texas in particular, we work with MALDEF, and we, again, wish them much success in their efforts to try to overturn the discriminatory redistricting maps that have been adopted by the state legislature. So that brings this to an end. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this session. And once again, we send out our thoughts to the people of Ukraine on this tragic day, and we hope that the events that are evolving end quickly and with as few casualties as possible. But we have to do all that we can here in this country to ensure that we have a strong and thriving democracy. And that is done by ensuring, first and foremost, that everybody who has a right to vote can do so freely. And we will continue to push that right throughout every day of our work. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you to all my colleagues in the NALEO Educational Fund who make this work possible. Dory and Carl, who provided the research, our communications team, who put together this presentation for you and today's event, and everybody, all my colleagues at the NALEO Educational Fund for all the work they do every day to promote the full participation of Latinos in the American political process. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Gracias.